Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was written by Quartermaster Sea. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about Abjurer supporters. We're going to review the four of them. These are a subclass in Arknights. They are a subclass of much debate. Quartermaster Sea says, so naturally it's time to weigh in on the topic. Now that Lone Trail event has wrapped up on the global servers, we have four Abjurer supporters in the game. Tsukinogi, Nine-Colored Deer, Quercus, and Silence the Paradigmatic. If possible, try to rate these units on two different scales, how niche or broadly useful they are, and how much you want them in your metaphorical toolbox. This hopefully allows for interesting cases like broadly useful but I don't want to use them, or incredibly niche and they have a permanent spot on my squad. Cool, sure, easy. Let's talk about what Abjurers do. Arknights has one of my favorite aspects of Arknights is the fact that classes and subclasses feel very distinct and meaningful, useful tools to have around with pretty specific roles. So supporters, not a very specific general class. Usually these are ranged, mostly units, subclasses that provide some support. You know, they debuff enemies, so they're easier to do damage to. They buff allies. A lot of the damage-focused supporters do their damage by attacking multiple targets, but not individually for that much damage. So while they can sometimes be damage dealers, they're generally effective when they're supporting damage dealers. Even if they are actually doing significant damage, it's usually not to a single target. Most of the units that buff your other operators in the game are also supporters with like damage or something, not just damage reduction. So Abjurers are, well, they're arts damage units. They have short but wide range, and their gimmick is that when you use their skills, they become healers, basically. So they start healing with their attacks instead of doing damage for the duration of their skill. The bad or problematic thing about Abjurers is that it then means that they're not always a healer or a damage dealer. You have to have a situation where you would for some reason want both, I guess. People tend to evaluate them badly because of this, but I don't really think that's bad. I think a lot of the time the benefit is that when you don't need a healer, they do damage. And, you know, if enemies are dead, you know what that'll do is they won't damage your operators, so you won't take damage. It's a tower defense game. If your units aren't taking damage, I mean, the thing you need to do is kill the enemies before they get to the objective. So I think they can be pretty good. You have them doing damage, and then if something bad happens to your units, you hit their skill and you switch them on to healing mode to patch up the damage. They go back to doing damage. I think Abjurers are especially good when they are not your only healer, though they can do, we'll get into that. But if you have a healer, a dedicated healer, always healing, and then an Abjurer that you're using as a damaging unit, but when you need to absorb incoming damage, they can switch to doing that for a sec. I think that is very effective a lot of the time. I really like this subclass. They're cool. So we're going to review the four of them. I am going to review them in order of how good I think they are, basically. So I won't rank them too specifically. I'll briefly touch on it on like how good I think they are. And then I'll just talk about how much I'm interested in them individually. So we'll get into it with each one, but they will be in a particular order, you know, from not really worst. It's not that they're the worst. At least three of these four have a very clear niche. So if you want that thing, I mean, they're the only one of the four that doesn't. But of course, that means we're going to start with Nine-Colored Deer. Nine-Colored Deer is free. I'm not going to talk too much about where they come from. Tsukinogi and Quercus, you roll. Silence and Nine-Colored Deer are free. But Nine-Colored Deer is like not a normal welfare. She's from a specific kind of yearly event. So she's not maybe the most accessible, but for longer time players, they'll just have this unit. You know, there's a stereotype that those are bad. A lot of Arknights freebies are incredibly good, as is the one we're going to get to at the end of this discussion. But Nine-Colored Deer is not, in my opinion. We're also going to use Nine-Colored Deer here to establish a couple of basic things that Abjurers usually have. So because their skill already turns them into a healer, a lot of the Abjurer skills are a little basic because they already make them into a healer. So they'll say like gain 30% attack or gain 30% attack speed or whatever, which sounds like a really bare bones skill. But remember that that does mean while that's active, they're going to be healing people. Do note that that means that they don't have any offensive skills. While they do attack when their healing isn't active, it's not like they're going to have a skill that's going to buff their damage because they can't do damage while their skill's active. So, meh. Generally, the Abjurers have passives which give damage reduction on some conditions. Nine-Colored Deer and Tsukunogi, the first two we're going to talk about, give their damage reduction when health is low. So when allies in their range have low health, like below half or so, 40%, 50%, they gain damage reduction, like 20% or so. We're not going to get too specific with numbers in this parlay. If you can't tell, if you wanted that, you would just look it up yourself. But yeah, basically they get about 20% damage reduction when allies' health is low. This isn't necessarily bad. I mean, it means that if they're not healing and then your operators take damage and then they're at low health, it helps prevent them from outright dying. You activate the skill, and then their health is worth more because they're at low health. They have the damage reduction, and you can tank them back up. So maybe that's okay. For a pure healer, I would be interested in the idea that it might be better to get the damage reduction at high health, which, well, there is one like that, so we'll get to her later. But anyway, Nine-Colored Deer gives damage reduction when they're at lower health. And she's a traditional Abjurer. She's just the basic one. She's got a skill that gives her attack speed. Her really only gimmick is that she has heavy personal damage reduction on one of her skills, so she can kind of tank while being a healer. There aren't that many units in Arknights that are really tanky that provide healing, but there are some, and a lot of the time healers end up doing an okay job of that just because they, heal, and she doesn't heal all the time, so as soon as that skill's over, she's just gonna die because she's a piece of paper. So I don't know. This one is a little sussy. She does give her damage reduction, like 20% or so, remember, 20-25%, to all allies regardless of health during her skill, her noteworthy skill that isn't just an attack boost. So I guess that's nice. She makes her team really tanky for a short time. On the surface, this is the unit that does the thing I just described. The, I think, kind of fun gameplay loop, where when there's big damage coming in, you hit the skill, it kind of reinforces your position and patches up the damage, and then it's deactivated and she goes back to doing very low damage. Yeah, so I do think this is by far the worst of the four, and there's the least to say. She hardly does anything. But at the same time, I think that sounds fun. I don't have Nine-Colored Deer yet, but I think I will enjoy and use her when I do. Cool. She looks real cool, too. Super interesting, very pretty looking unit as well. But that's by the by. That's another video. Tsukunogi. This is, they're both 5 stars, by the way. Tsukunogi has a similar damage reduction passive. So when allies are at low health, she grants, they're almost the same, about the same damage reduction, a modest 20-30%. And she's kind of the same kind of Abjurer, no big tricks yet. She, has skills, normal skills with decent, uptime, and then they cycle, they take a little while to recharge. So she'll be healing in bursts, kind of the same gameplay loop as Nine-Colored Deer. But she has a lot more utility. The two big things are that she has a modest dodge chance buff she can do. So her skill 1, I believe, you give the entire area she affects, her entire range, gets about 1 in 3 chance to dodge all incoming damage. This is kind of like Nine-Colored Deer's skill, where she gets heavy personal range damage reduction, and then you give her damage reduction regardless of the health of the allies in range. So another one of those kind of reinforce type skills. In theory, pretty fun. The catch with this one is it also reveals all invisible enemies in range. The cycle time is kind of bad. I think it's like 40 or 50 seconds. So after you've used it, it's down for about that much time. That's bad. It's not terrible, but it's not good cycle time. But revealing all invisible enemies in range is a rare effect. I like that while she has it up, she'll have the dodge chance. So if you put her in a dangerous position, invisible enemies appear that are often more problematic if they're attacking you, then she has a way to kind of help tank them. Nice. She'll be healing. She still gets her damage reduction if she ends up at low health. Okay, maybe not a bad package. So certainly some utility. From a type of unit that is pretty specific, you need to, if you're going to do my version of the strategy, you need to want 2 healers. You need to not be taking damage very steadily. There has to be only some moments when damage is coming in. You need to care about the mediocre damage output they do when they're off skill. So probably a pretty target-rich environment if that's going to be significant. And yet you don't want to use some other operator that would just do way more damage during the time. Anyway, whatever. But she does have a niche, I think. There's not that much invisibility reveal in Arknights. There are options available, but I mean, there's like less than 10. It's meaningful to have another one on your roster. And then her second skill has this interesting, like, she becomes a true AoE healer. So she stops attacking during this skill, but she just does heal everybody in range for a set amount. So she switches to being like a health regen in an area unit, and she increases the damage reduction of her talent. So if people are at low health, they get much more significant, like 40-50%-ish damage reduction. Not bad. Again, pretty much the same thing. I think that's the biggest knock you could give this one, is it's kind of the same thing as her skill 1, but it lacks the invisibility utility. So not great, and in my opinion, not very exciting. I guess that's my big problem. I kind of like the idea of 9-colored deer personally becoming really tanky when she uses her skill, whereas Tsukunogi, I feel like this is it's fairly by the book, but if you want the invisibility reveal, I think that is a functional way to get it. Like, fine if that's what you need. I kind of forget if the startup time is good, so in other words, when you deploy Tsukunogi, the first time you use her skill, I'm going to check this, is the amount of skill points you get good? So can you use it the first time pretty quickly? The answer is not really. Between 20 and 25 of the 50 skill points you need. So it'll still take a meaningful amount of time. You still have to prepare quite in advance. You can't really hot drop her and reveal invisible enemies. That would be significantly better, in my opinion. A lot better. That's helpful to have. But no dice, not really. Okay. But weirdly, even though this is a more kind of niche unit, which you would think by the book I would want more, I want to use this unit less. I do own Tsukunogi. I own all 4 of these except 9-colored deer, who again is free and I believe coming back soon. So I will own all 4 of them. I'll have the choice of the 4 of them soon. But I own and haven't invested in Tsukunogi. I think it's just because I feel like there are better ways to reveal invisible, and she's otherwise essentially 9-colored deer, but just somehow less exciting to me. I don't really like dodge chance. I think dodge chance is kind of scary as well. You take the full damage or you take no damage. And don't get me wrong, I think dodge chance is good a lot of the time in Arknights. You have huge amounts of damage coming in you would never be able to soak, and you just negate them now and again. A unit that uses dodge chance, who I really enjoy actually, is Mayor. She has a thing where she can deploy these robo-dogs as little summons on the map, and they have a thing where they can give their dodge chance, physical and arts dodge, quite like this skill from Tsukunogi. They can give that to nearby operators as well, so you can put a dog behind or beside an operator and they'll have a chance to dodge incoming damage. Again, about a third 1 in 3 chance. That can be pretty significant damage reduction. And the thing about the dogs is I often deploy them to soak damage. So if they do dodge incoming damage, it's just a bonus. I'm planning for them to get hit and die. That's why I deployed them there. But if they soak up more damage for longer, great. The problem here, I think, is that to make the invisible work, she has to survive. So it's kind of like I have to get lucky. I don't know how likely I am to survive the damage, or if I would get one shot, I might survive 5 hits or 1 hit. It's kind of hard to know, So I don't know. I guess I'm not the biggest fan. I think this character's design is cool, but I'm also not the hugest fan either. She feels quite... all the Abjurers feel quite derivative of each other. That's a criticism I have, but we're not really getting into that too much in this video. I feel like they look similar, and I just like, of this aesthetic, I like Tsukunogi less. Next up is Quercus. Quercus we're getting a little bit different now. Quercus and Silence the Paradigmatic are going to be a little weird in this group. So the first thing about Quercus is her damage reduction effect is different. 9-colored deer and Tsukunogi had the damage reduction when the allies are at half health. So if people fall below about half, 40%, 50% in their range, they take less damage. Quercus gives the damage reduction when you're above half, 70, 60% health. Depends on what level her skills are, but around above half health, a little higher. That's when you get the damage reduction. I think this sounds worse at first if you're going to do the thing I was doing with the other two. You put them in the squad. When you are taking big damage, you reinforce the squad, they get damage reduction, and you heal them back up. But the thing about Quercus is her skill 1 lets her become a healer permanently. So if you're just topping allies off, well, damage reduction when they're at higher health sounds pretty good because you can actually keep them at that amount of health. Quercus's skill 1 lets her, it's got unlimited duration, and then you can manually deactivate it. It's got a 45 or so second startup time, but it basically means if you deploy her and just wait about half a 2/3 of a minute, 3/4 of a minute, she can permanently become a healer and just keep healing everybody. And the benefit of that over a normal healer is she has unique range, which is often what matters with a healer. You just need to be able to place them so they will actually touch the people you need to heal. And a lot of healers are like basically just the healer, but they have weird range. So I think that's useful. Quercus having weird range isn't just like a factoid. I think that is actually useful. She has high attack speed relative to other healers, so her healing throughput is somewhat competitive if you invest in her similarly to other healers. She has that startup time, but if once she's active, somewhat competitive actual healing, but then she does it in more smaller heals because she has more attack speed, relatively less attack. I think that's a good trade. It means you can top people off if that's going to be her niche. So I think pretty good. My experience with Quercus has been good. I actually use her in this role. We're getting to the units I actually have leveled. It's useful. If you need a supporter that's a healer for integrated strategies, you get a supporter ticket and you need a healer. She's essentially a medic. She just has that startup time. And a lot of the time, you don't need the healing at the very beginning of a mission because nothing has happened yet. So provided you're able to deploy her early, the startup time isn't a huge deal a lot of the time. Anyway. Another bonus for supporters is they have kind of low DP cost, so you can deploy them pretty early. They're cheap to deploy. Quercus is skill 2, so we have a more traditional Abjurer skill. You know, it's got a charge time. For a little while, she'll be healing your team, and then she goes back to doing damage. It's one of those. Gives her attack speed. Again, I think that's one of the better things you could be getting, rather than bigger heals, faster heals, all things being equal, and they usually are, like 30% buffs here. I think it's better to have the attack speed. So attack speed, great. And then she restores a skill point to anyone she heals during the duration. These abilities usually require the unit to receive healing. So they need to need health. They have to have taken damage, and then they will gain a skill point. But these effects are very powerful. In particular, something that I think is strong about these types of effects is you can potentially chain two of them into each other. So a unit that comes to mind is Saria. She also is a passive, where when she heals a nearby ally, they gain a skill point. Now she's a defender, she's a healing defender. And she has something kind of similar, like a burst skill that heals in a big area, lots of little ticks, quite like this. And it restores skill points to everybody in that area. She's great with that Abjurer niche I talked about before, of reinforcing the front line in a moment where a lot of damage and enemies are coming in. She uses her skill 3, heals everybody up, slows the enemies, they take more damage, and then people get their skills back and you can pop off. You can see how that could be pretty powerful if you had another unit who, if their skill was charged by being healed by Saria, they could then do the same thing. And if healing Saria, they can charge her skill that charges their skill that charges her skill, and back and forth. Quercus has very good cycle time here, the skill point restoring thing. It doesn't have very high downtime. It's like 20 or 30 seconds. It's pretty good uptime. So you can have it ready when you want it. It doesn't last super long. It's like 15, 20 seconds, but you can have it ready when you need it. And yeah, I think that's good. Saria's uptime is not like that, but I think that's good. That's a useful niche. And I think the key is that Quercus is essentially a medic, and then you also get that additional utility when many medics have no further utility beyond just healing. Therefore, she kind of already gets a high grade in my mind. I like this type of unit. The idea that she just has a quirk where you can't get the healing right away is not really a problem for me. I don't really mind that loss in reliability. She creates an interesting new option for like a size, a range size of healer, and has an interesting niche as well. And what's more fun than getting to do your skills more often? Hell yeah. The only thing that can be difficult sometimes is getting your units to actually take damage without dying so you can restore their skill points. But it's only a sideshow. You just get that for free from leveling her as like a weird, different medic. I'm a big fan. So yeah, I think she's good, legitimately strong, probably not that much better or more useful than Tsukunogi to most people's accounts. You could look at the two of them and say, well, Tsukunogi reveals invisible. Isn't that a more unique utility than a healer but a different shape. You know what I mean? I kind of think those are both not that powerful. I just feel like more people will actually use Quercus. If you put Quercus on every player's account and reminded them to use her or consider using her anytime that would be useful, Quercus would be useful more of the time. I guess that's what I would argue. Tsukinogi's niche is more unique, but also less useful. Like, you don't need it as often, or it doesn't do anything as often. Whereas Quercus can potentially be beneficial lots of the time, and is essentially just leveling a medic, but then you also get some utility from the skill point restore if you want to use that. So I'm a big fan. Yeah, I also just really like Quercus. I don't think she's objectively, even though that doesn't exist, or whatever, objectively that much better than Nine Colored Deer and Tsukinogi, but I like her much more. And I would argue that in practice, she maybe is more useful. Being able to just be a healer is good, I think. Finally, we come to Silence. Silence is also a welfare, so she gets credit for that. She's a normal welfare. You play the event, you get her for free if you play through the event. But she is a 6-star, so she costs more than these other 3 to level up, quite a bit more. And of course, the event isn't on Record Restoration yet, so if you didn't play it recently, it'll rerun, and then you'll be able to pick her up. But you may need to wait a little while, and then if you don't do that rerun, you might need to wait a little while again for the Record Restoration. So free, but you do need to be around for when that comes out. Good stuff. Okay, so unlike Nine Colored Deer and Tsukinogi, who had damage reduction when your units are at low health, and Quercus, who gave damage reduction when your units are at high health, Silence gives damage reduction all the time, but it's the weakest damage reduction effect. So she gives more like just 10 or 12%, but all the time. It doesn't matter what health your allies are. And being a 6-star, Silence also is another passive. So she heals allies in range all the time if they're below 50% health. She provides health regen based on their max HP to all allies all the time if they're below 50% HP. So even though Silence isn't going to do the thing that Quercus does, where she can permanently activate a skill and become like a healer or a medic, she kind of does do that, where if you use her to do burst healing and then she goes back to attacking, but then you need healing in the interim, she does do that. She does do a little bit of that. I am fairly high on health regeneration. I think that it's an underrated effect. I think a lot of the time, if you would need the burst healing, it's often better to do burst damage instead. And health regen often allows you to sustain many, many units through obnoxiously chip damage. Like, they are taking some damage technically, but you're doing tons of outgoing damage to enemies. You just can't avoid taking a little bit of damage, and health regen just makes that go away, and then you get to do whatever you're going to do. Furthermore, I think that Silence is made stronger by the fact that she has extremely powerful survivability when you need it for an ally, and also provides like this very soft form of survivability. You get a little health regen as well. I think those are really good. Medium amount of healing, like, what's that? That's useless. It's not, but I think it's very nice to have either this unit outright cannot die, period, they just can't die, screw you, I don't care what you're doing, this unit just can't die, or they do technically have healing coming in, but not very much. I kind of feel like those are the more useful extremes, and Silence does both. Let's talk about skill 3 first. So her signature thing is that she has a skill that has pretty quick charge up time, and it lasts a long time. It's like a minute duration. So the uptime is very high, and the recharge time is not super long, kind of modest, like a lot of these skills have been, but the uptime is really high. It's like a minute. She heals, she provides more damage reduction during that time, I believe. And she can, one time during the skill's duration, make it so an operator in range just doesn't die for 10 seconds. They basically just become immortal for 10 seconds instead of dying, and then they, presumably die. Or maybe survive, I don't know. She can only use that skill twice per mission, but the duration of the skill is 60 seconds. The cycle time is modest, not really a problem, not a huge bad thing, but it's not that quick. And then that would be another 60 seconds? Most Arknights missions are over at that point. So while it might be a problem for a really long mission or like an Annihilation, for normal play, there might as well not be a restriction on the number of times you can use it. I don't think that really matters. 7 to 10 seconds of immortality to any unit you want. I don't think that's that good. If you brought 2 burst damage units, you probably wouldn't need to survive for 10 seconds. You would just kill the enemy. That being said, it's not like it has no uses. You might have a unit really, really tanky that you just need to hold. You just gotta hold someone back. Or you have the good burst damage, but you just have to block. There's something coming in and you need it to stay still so you can do damage to it. And this lets you do that. You could potentially get a unit that is very, very squishy and make them unkillable instead, but they probably hit really good damage in exchange for being really squishy, so you could get kind of a monster. I think the bigger thing for me, though, is that skill that makes a unit unkillable for a little bit, well, it makes Silence a healer for most of the time, and then you have the health regen when she's not on the ability, when it's down. So you can view it more like insurance. You can use Silence as basically a healer, pretty much like Quercus, just with a little bit of weird downtime, but that might not be a huge issue. And then if someone dies, you get the bonus that you have kind of life insurance on that unit. Silence's damage reduction also gets stronger the lower health allies get, so she kind of a little bit has the best of both worlds with Tsukunogi and 9-colored Deer's lower health damage reduction, and Quercus's high health damage reduction. She gives it all the time, but it's stronger when they're at low health. I think in theory that's really good. The bonus she gets to her output during her skill that makes someone not die is just attack, yawn, but I mean, she can heal or whatever. So in some ways, you could argue this is a different insurance policy type from Quercus's permanent healing. Not a bad thing to have around. Personally, I don't know if I would level this skill specifically, though. Like, if you, in Arknights, you level all skills up to 7 together. It doesn't cost more to level each individual skill, but then only levels 8, 9, and 10, you have to level skills individually. For this skill, 8, 9, and 10 gives you 8, 9, and 10 seconds of undieability from this skill instead of just 7. I feel like 7 is probably enough a lot of the time, and the other parts of the skill don't really improve much. So while having unit be just unkillable is sort of a thing that it would be relevant to have last longer, sure. If you really need that effect, having it be longer seems useful. I also kind of feel like that maybe isn't actually the more practically useful aspect of the skill, and if it's going to be insurance instead of part of your plan, I think it matters a lot less how long the survivability lasts, since 7 seconds is still pretty good. I want to talk about her skill 2 as well. This is a little weird. It gives her attack speed. Her damage reduction increases quite a bit. It's like 2.5 or 3 times the damage reduction, so significant damage reduction passive all the time. And remember, it still gets stronger as you get lower and lower health. That probably increases too. She gets an attack speed boost, quick heals. This skill has a very quick cycle time, so you can get the healing when you need it. And then she gets a drone. The drone lets you deploy a thing on the map somewhere that gives her damage reduction. So you can throw her damage reduction somewhere she's out of range of temporarily. She can't heal in that range, but if you had another healer, which is kind of what I was recommending doing if you use Abjurers, you have healing normally, but then you have more healing when you need it. This kind of makes sense. Like if you had a health regen healer, like Perfumer, over there healing some units, and then Silence is down here, these units need healing less often. Oh no, they need healing, you hit the button, and then if you need to throw some damage reduction up top to the Perfumer group, then you can do that. That's how I imagine using this skill. That's how I've used it so far. It has good cycle time, so if you wanted to use her as just like the Abjurer thing, you pop for some damage when damage is incoming, that's what I would use. I think that's what I have to say about the 4 of them. I really like Silence the Paradigmatic. I think she's a cool unit. I'll be honest that I'm actually mostly interested in a weird kind of group quirk she has. She has a Rhine Lab specific passive. So in Arknights, there are some groups of units that are paired together and sometimes have abilities that make them stronger when they're used together. These are interestingly balanced in Arknights. They're not super strong a lot of the time. The magnitude is not super high. But I also think they're not negligible. They're often not flavor. Like they actually are a significant increase. They're just not so powerful that it's like really broken to bring them all together. It varies. It does vary now that I think about it. There are examples like the Abyssal Hunter passives, where they all get an effect they have passives. They each have a passive that affects the entire squad of Abyssal Hunters. So one of them might give attack speed, and all other Abyssal Hunter units in the squad also get that attack speed. One might have an attack boost, but all the other Abyssal Hunters in the squad also get the attack boost. You get it. Those are really overpowered. They're really broken. And there are other ones that come to mind, like Nero the Radiant Knight has a thing where another unit from Casimir's being deployed like in order with her, like before her, makes her get a little bit of extra damage on some of her skills or deploy back again faster. It's not noticeable in my opinion. Like, I just don't think that matters much. This is kind of in the middle. The benefit for Rhinelab units is that Silence's health regen is doubled in range. So remember that thing where she regenerates health for allies in range when they're below 50% health. It's a percent of their health. The percent is double for Rhinelab operators. Now it's 5% at base. 10% health regeneration per second is a lot. And they get damage reduction, remember, too. It only heals them back to 50%, but I still feel like that's nice to have. I mean, unless they take focused damage, Rhinelab units in range of Silence just won't die, probably. They'll have meaningful damage reduction and pretty significant health regen. So unless they're a piece of paper and they take sufficient incoming damage, they're probably not going to die. I think that's good, potentially. I like that for example, Saria is a nice pairing. Saria has a couple of her own healing abilities, but one of them is one of the doesn't activate till below 50% health types. So with this, if she's out of that ability, she still gets the sustain, and she also won't waste her own healing. I think that's potentially interesting. Another gimmick is with Ifrit. Ifrit is a Rhinelab unit that has a flamethrower third ability that does damage to her over time. Silence will make sure she doesn't get too low from using it, but also not too high, so you can potentially heal her and give her skill points from Quercus or Silence, who's probably on the same squad. Pretty interesting. That's something I do a lot. That skill already is good uptime, so increasing it more is pretty fun. Anyway, they don't have incredibly lockstep synergy, which I think is good. It doesn't feel like you're not getting anything out of these units if you don't use them together, but they do something extra when they're in a squad together, which I think is fun. And there's not the worst reason to put them in a squad together. One more thing for Silence's Undie a unit ability. So you can use it with Ak. Ak has a skill where he heavily buffs a unit in front of him and himself, but the unit in front of him takes a ton of damage. He shoots them a bunch of times, but if they live, they get a bunch of buffs. Well, you can just make them impossible to kill. Just in case you want to buff a unit that's really squishy, get him in there. I haven't tried that yet, but that is why I was excited to get Silence, because I love Ak buffing, but it kills you. So I think that's fun. Sure, yeah, a fun utility to have around. And in the first place, the discussion of how good the unkillable ability is, I mean, it doesn't matter that much to me. I think the takeaway is whether that sounds fun to you. It can be useful. It doesn't really matter whether that is the most or whatever efficient way to do things, because we don't know what the most efficient way to do things is. Whenever people argue that, like, well, that isn't, it's usually better to whatever. Well, it's not better if you don't know how to do things in a differently efficient way, or if you enjoy doing it this way and they both work. It's not really better or worse for it to take more or less effort. You're playing the game to have fun. So I personally think that means that unique effects are the only thing that can really be evaluated as being inherently valuable, because they at least correlate with people using them. Because if you want that effect, this is where you can get that effect. Whether or not the effect is good or not is weirdly a lot less reliably valuable, in my opinion. And that's why I think Silence is pretty good, potentially. Why I think Quercus is pretty good, potentially. Tsukinogi, while being evaluated as being a terrible unit, for whatever reason, who knows, I think the invisible reveal niche is almost objective proof that the unit is at least theoretically fairly useful. And I just don't think there's any other useful evaluation of how good a unit is. The only reason I'm down on 9-Colored Deer is because she really doesn't do that much that's that unique, or the things she does do are things other Abjurers do, heavy tankiness ability for a limited time. 3 of these 4 units have that. So while it might be useful, it's very ununique. She does do it in kind of a unique way. Just quickly, 9-Colored Deer also doesn't reduce incoming damage to herself during her skill that reduces incoming damage if it's arts damage. She only heavily reduces physical ranged damage. That's a little specific for my taste. More to the point, to be honest, I often just don't know. You could read the enemies and make sure it's physical damage, but if you didn't, so. Anyway, they're a fun type of unit. I really like talking about the subclasses in Arknights because they're cool. Abjurers are kind of the mirror to Hexers. Hexers are debuffers for enemies, usually offensive debuffs that make enemies easier to kill. Sometimes defensive debuffs that make enemies weaker when they attack you, but usually offensive debuffs. And Abjurers are basically the opposite. They're like clerics. They give defensive buffs to your units and heal, just not all the time. And I think the big drawback with Abjurers is that if the damage they were outputting was more significant when their skill wasn't active, it would feel like you get the best of both worlds if you know how much healing you need. But the problem is that when they're actually attacking, when their skill's down, I would argue it just doesn't do all that much. But at the same time, I'm a lot higher on Abjurers than most people are. So if you play Arknights, and this is an archetype that's weirded you out a little bit, I hope that I got you interested in maybe trying them a little bit. It might seem awkward or annoying that they don't heal all the time, but I think it often doesn't matter. And they might as well be attacking if your team doesn't need the healing. So I don't know, I think they're cool. Thanks for the parlay. It was a lot of fun. Folks, if you want to get your own, you can do that using a link in the description. Looking forward to the next ones.